I sold my tech empire for $50 million and took my son to a fine restaurant to celebrate. While my son raised his glass and smiled at my success, a waiter leaned in and whispered words that stopped my heart cold. "I saw your son put something in your wine." I didn't scream. I didn't call the police. I didn't even look at him. I quietly stood up, walked out into the freezing night air, and began executing a plan they would never expect. One small thing before we go any further. I truly appreciate you taking the time to listen to my journey today. If you're still here, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. Your presence here truly matters. Also, please note, this story includes some fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real names or settings is purely coincidental, but the message I'm conveying to you is truly valuable and worth remembering. The vintage Cabernet hit the back of my throat like liquid gold, but the man standing behind me was already counting the seconds until my heart stopped. I am Lance Griffin, a 68-year-old retired software architect, with eyes as sharp as a compiled line of code and a watch that Maria bought me for my first million. Tonight, at the head of this table at the terrace, I was supposed to be the master of the universe. The celebration wasn't just a dinner. It was a meticulously set trap where the celebrants were actually waiting for the host to expire. The $50 million exit from Griffin Systems was finally a reality. After 30 years of debugging and the relentless architecture of digital empires, I had signed the last paper. The Chicago sunset poured through the windows, bathing our table in a warm, deceptive amber glow. I ran a thumb over the leather strap of my watch, feeling the ghost of Maria's hand. "I wish you were here to see the river tonight, Maria," I whispered in the quiet hall of my thoughts. 30 years for one signature. The weight of the triumph was enough to make my lungs feel thin. It should have been a night of absolute victory. But in my line of work, the most dangerous errors are the ones that look like success. My son arrived exactly at 7, flanked by his wife, appearing like the definition of the American dream. Easton Griffin, my 38-year-old son, adjusted his Italian silk tie with a hand that lacked my steady resolve, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. Beside him was Megan Griffin, 34, a pharmaceutical consultant, with a notebook constantly open and a gaze that appraised everything for its market value. They moved with a practiced predatory grace, offering congratulations that felt as thin as a single line of unoptimized code. "We are so proud of you," Dad Easton said, his voice smooth but hollow. 50 million. It is life-changing. Megan leaned in her perfume, a sharp, clinical floral. "To the next chapter, Lance. You have earned the rest." I watched them, my analytical mind mapping the subtle, nervous energy in Easton's hands. It was a glitch in an otherwise perfect interface. In software, a single bug in the kernel can crash the entire system. I was looking at my son, and for the first time, I saw the syntax error in his smile. He was too eager for the second round of drinks, too focused on the waiter's movements. I sat at the head of the table, the patriarch of a dying dynasty, feeling the vibration of the jazz bass through the floorboards. The golden glow of the Chicago sunset was fading, now replaced by the artificial, cold blue lights of the skyline. We talked about the future, about the Astor Foundation I planned to build in Maria's name, and about the legacy of Griffin Systems. They listened with the kind of forced patience a predator shows its prey. Easton led Megan to the dance floor as the jazz trio started a slow melody. I was alone for a moment, the cold sweat on the wine glass chilling my palm. That was when I felt a presence at my shoulder. Aaron Platt, a 42-year-old floor captain, with a gaze that missed nothing between the tables, leaned down to whisper a sentence that would change my world. He didn't bring the menu. He didn't ask about dessert. "Mr. Griffin, do not touch that glass again," he murmured, his voice a low vibration beneath the saxophone. I froze. The world didn't tilt. It simply stopped. The jazz music became white noise, a distorted screech in my ears. I saw the young man drop something into your wine while the band started. Aaron continued, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he were merely discussing the weather. My heart hammered against my ribs, a jagged rhythm. I looked at the deep red liquid in my glass, the same color as the blood in my veins, and realized my son wasn't waiting for a toast. He was waiting for a funeral. I didn't blink. In my world, when a system is compromised, you don't scream. You isolate the threat and secure the data. I stared at the deep red liquid in my glass, the same color as the blood in my veins, and realized my son wasn't waiting for a toast, he was waiting for a funeral. The ice in my chest was a physical weight, cold and jagged. I could see the reflection of the lanterns dancing in the wine, mocking the supposed celebration of my life's work. I've spent 40 years building firewalls against hackers and corporate espionage, but I never thought to build one against my own blood. As Easton and Megan glided back from the dance floor, their faces flushed with the hollow joy of the hunt, I adjusted my internal architecture. I reached into the pocket of my suit jacket, my fingers brushing against the small, empty plastic pill bottle I carry for my cardiac medication. The architect in me is always prepared for a system failure, though I never imagined the failure would be a moral one. "Beautiful song, isn't it, Easton?" I said, my voice coming out as smooth as a polished line of code. I swirled the Cabernet, pretending to admire the bouquet, watching the oily legs of the wine slide down the glass. "I'm just savoring the finish." "This vintage is complex." I caught a glimpse of Easton's eyes. There was a hunger there, a predatory flicker that I had mistaken for ambition for 38 years. While Aaron Platt moved to a neighboring table to refill water glasses, creating the necessary line-of-sight obstruction, I leaned toward the large potted fern beside our table. With a quick, practiced motion that felt like deleting a corrupted file, I dumped the majority of the liquid into the damp soil. Have you ever felt the air turn to lead in your lungs? That's what happens when you realize the person who shares your DNA is counting your heartbeats. My heart gave a singular, traitorous twitch against my ribs. Under the cover of the heavy white tablecloth, I unscrewed the cap of the pill bottle. My hands were steady, a byproduct of a lifetime spent in high-pressure environments, but my soul was screaming. I poured a small, concentrated amount of the remaining wine into the bottle and secured the cap. The click of the plastic felt like the locking of a vault. I tucked the forensic evidence back into my pocket, feeling its warmth through the expensive silk lining. I could feel the cold sweat on my original glass, a testament to the biological reality I was currently fighting. To the outside world, I was just a man enjoying a $50 million sunset. The restaurant was a stage, the jazz was the soundtrack, and I was a man playing the role of a victim while carrying the evidence of my own attempted murder in my pocket. I looked at Megan. She was watching me with an inquisitive gaze, her pharmaceutical mind, perhaps calculating the onset time of whatever cocktail they'd prepared. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with a harsh, discordant sound. "I need air," I announced, cutting through Easton's feigned concern. I think the excitement of the deal is finally catching up with me. Indigestion, perhaps. "Dad, is everything okay?" Easton asked, stepping toward me. I didn't let him touch me. "Stay. Finish the bottle." I said the words, tasting like copper. I have a forgotten server emergency at the office. I dropped a stack of $100 bills on the table, enough to cover the bill, and the silence I hoped I'd bought from Aaron. I nodded once to the floor captain, as I passed him a silent acknowledgement of the life he had just handed back to me. I caught Easton's reflection in a large, gilt-edged mirror near the exit. He wasn't looking at my back with the worry of a son. He was staring at my empty wine glass with a predatory calculation that made my skin crawl. I hit the cool, humid night air of Whacker Drive, the pill bottle burning a hole in my suit jacket. Behind me, the string lights of the terrace looked like a row of hangman's nooses dangling over the river. The leather interior of my car usually smelled like success and expensive cedar, but tonight it felt like a sealed coffin on wheels. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine idling with a low, predatory hum that vibrated through my spine. Outside, the night air of Whacker Drive was thick with the humidity of a dying summer, and the string lights of the restaurant receded in my rearview mirror like a row of hangman's nooses. I pulled into traffic, my movements mechanical and precise, the way I used to write code before the world became about signatures and boardrooms. I was being hunted by my own DNA. My eyes darted to the mirrors every 3 seconds, scanning for the silver sedan Easton favored, or any headlight that lingered too long in my wake. I reached for the console, deactivating the GPS and killing the phone's location, sharing with a series of sharp taps. It was a bitter irony. Every digital convenience I had personally helped design for the city's elite was now a tracking beacon for the man I used to carry on my shoulders. I realized then that the safety features I helped integrate into Riverside Towers were exactly what Easton would try to exploit. He knew my logic. He knew my back doors. I was the architect, but he was the apprentice who had spent a lifetime studying the blueprints of my mind. "Focus, Lance," I whispered to the empty cabin. Code red. Isolate the intruder. I forced my breathing to slow, treating the panic as a rogue process that needed to be terminated. The streets of Chicago blurred past a kaleidoscope of cold neon and dark shadows as I navigated a path that was as much about evasion as it was about reaching home. The drive felt like a descent into a darker reality, where the fundamental laws of family had been overwritten by a malicious script. Do you know what it sounds like when 30 years of trust snaps? It is not a bang. It is the hollow sound of a biometric lock clicking into place against your own child. I reached Riverside Towers and pulled into the secure garage, my hands tight on the wheel. I didn't take the elevator to my floor immediately. Instead, I stopped at the desk. Mr. Anderson, the night shift concierge, whose voice was as polished as the lobby's marble, answered on the first ring when I called from the internal line. My voice was a cold, clinical rasp of authority as I gave the order. "Easton Griffin is no longer authorized," I told him. "Not the lobby, not the gym, and especially not my floor. Revoke the permanent access key and the facial recognition profile immediately." Mr. Anderson didn't ask questions. He was paid for his discretion. "Yes, Mr. Griffin," he replied. "I will update the biometric database at once." The sterile hum of the elevator as I ascended to the 18th floor felt like a countdown. My hands finally started to shake, not out of fear, but from the sheer energy it took to keep my world from splintering into a million jagged pieces. Inside Unit 18B, I didn't turn on the lights. I moved through the kitchen like a ghost, clearing the pantry with a methodical, ruthless efficiency. I dumped every open bottle of water and swept my prescription medications into a trash bag. Bleach. I needed the smell of bleach to drown out the scent of betrayal. While I scrubbed the counter, I found a glossy, slightly bent photo tucked near the toaster. It was 1994. Easton was 8, learning to ride a bike, looking at me with a face full of pure, unadulterated love. When did the binary flip? When did you become a virus? I stared at the boy in the photo, a memory of a son who no longer existed, now replaced by a man who wanted me in the ground. I realized the wine sample in my pocket was a timer. If I didn't get it tested within 24 hours, the proof might degrade. The screen of my phone lit up, casting a cold blue glow over the photo. One new message from Easton: Dad, where'd you go? We're worried. Don't do something you'll regret. I didn't wait for the sun to clear the Chicago skyline before I began the process of erasing my son's existence from my life. The night had been a grueling marathon of silence, punctuated only by the cold blue glow of my smartphone sitting on the bedside table. I sat by the window of Unit 18B watching the first light of dawn struggle against the heavy shadows of the Willis Tower, my mind racing through lines of defensive logic. The message on my screen from Easton was still there, a digital parasite feeding on my exhaustion. Dad, where'd you go? We're worried. Don't do something you'll regret. I realized then that the text wasn't an expression of concern. It was a ping, a tactical query, sent to see if the drug had already induced the intended disorientation. He wasn't checking on my heart. He was checking on his investment, waiting for the system to crash so he could reboot it in his favor. At 7:30 a.m. sharp, I picked up the phone. My voice was a clinical rasp as I called Patricia Coleman. Patricia, the system is compromised, I told her without preamble. I need a clean environment by noon. There was a pause on the other end, long enough for me to hear the faint hum of her own early morning activity. Lance, she replied, her tone shifting from professional to wary. You sound like you've seen a ghost. Or a crime. Maybe both, I said, the weight of the pill bottle in my pocket feeling heavier with every passing second. I'll be there in 30 minutes. I showered and dressed in a dark suit that felt more like armor than silk. By the time I reached the 12th floor of the LaSalle Street building, the city was awake, but I felt like I was moving through a simulation. Patricia Coleman, 52, a high-stakes attorney, whose office overlooked the river with the same gray coldness as her legal briefs, leaned across the mahogany desk as I entered. She didn't offer coffee. She saw the plastic pill bottle in my hand and the way I held my jaw rigid. I laid the wine sample on her desk, the cold condensation forming a ring on the polished wood that smelled of expensive mahogany and old paper. I told her everything, the warning from Aaron, the glint in Easton's eyes, the text. For a brief moment, my voice cracked when I had to say the word son, the biological weight of it nearly overriding my logic. He's still my son, Patricia. I taught him to ride a bike on these very streets. Patricia didn't blink. She cut through the emotion with surgical precision. Lance, look at the river, she said, gesturing to the gray, choppy water of the Chicago River below. It doesn't care about the history of the water, only the current. Start with facts you can prove, not feel. In software, when the core is corrupted, you don't patch the code because the error lies in the structure. You build a new environment and migrate the assets. That was the language I needed. I watched her gold pen move across the yellow legal pad, drafting the firebreaks of my new reality. We began the audit, revoking power of attorney, changing every beneficiary, and initiating the Astor Foundation. It felt like drawing a new blueprint for a building that was already on fire. Am I destroying him or saving myself? I asked, the words hollow in the sterile office air. You're drawing boundaries. Lance, Patricia replied, her pen never stopping its rhythmic tapping. That's not a weapon. It's architecture. How do you tell a woman who has known your family for 20 years that your legacy is currently trying to accelerate your probate. You don't. You just show her the data and let the law do the work. But as Patricia scanned the final document in my primary file, her rhythmic tapping stopped. She leaned forward, her eyes scanning a paragraph I hadn't noticed in years. "Lancy, there's a trusted party designation on your primary account from a year ago," she said, her voice dropping as she turned the monitor toward me. "Easton is already inside the vault." I clutched the pill bottle in my pocket, like a live grenade as I stepped into the sterile white silence of Riverside Private Diagnostics. The transition from Patricia's wood-paneled office to this clinical sanctuary was jarring, a shift from the theoretical world of legal briefs to the physical reality of toxins and blood chemistry. I didn't wait for the revolving doors to stop spinning before I headed straight for the intake desk. The lobby smelled of hospital-grade antiseptic and ozone, a scent that usually promised recovery, but today only reinforced my sense of peril. I watched the other patients, wealthy individuals in tailored coats, buying a few more years of high-priced life, and felt like an alien carrying a piece of a murder plot in my tailored wool. "I have a priority intake," I said to the receptionist, my voice steady, despite the hammer of my pulse against my ribs. "Code Coleman Delta." She didn't look up, her fingers tapping a rhythm on her keyboard that sounded like rain on a tin roof. "Room 4, Mr. Griffin. Dr. Stone is waiting." I walked down the hallway, the bright, flickering fluorescent lights overhead, casting long, jagged shadows on the linoleum. I realized then that the lab wasn't just checking for a simple poison. They were looking for interaction markers, substances that are harmless on their own, but lethal when combined with my specific heart medication. It was a sophisticated attack on the very system keeping me alive. Have you ever handed over a piece of your own potential death to a stranger in a lab coat? It's a strange kind of surrender. Dr. Jennifer Stone, a woman in her late 40s with a surgical precision in her movements and eyes that saw through flesh to the chemistry beneath, met me in the windowless intake room. The snap of her latex gloves echoed in the small space like a gunshot. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You have the sample, Lance." I pulled the plastic bottle from my pocket and placed it on the cold metal tray. The crinkle of the paper on the exam table beneath me sounded incredibly loud in the silence. I watched her every move, insisting on witnessing the sealing and labeling. I wasn't just a patient. I was a witness to my own betrayal. Every form I signed felt like another nail in the coffin of the life I had known only 24 hours ago. "Mr. Griffin, we follow a legal chain of custody here," Dr. Stone said as she carefully applied the tamper-evident seal. "Once I seal this, it doesn't exist to the world until the report is generated. I need a full toxicology screen," I insisted. "Everything from heavy metals to prescription sedatives." The lab was like a clean room for microchips. No dust, no emotion, just raw data waiting to be decoded by a machine that didn't care about my family history. Dr. Stone looked at the dark red liquid and then at me with a professional curiosity that bordered on pity. She noted the urgency on the intake form, her gold pen scratching across the surface. "If there is something in here, Lance, it was put there with intent. This isn't a kitchen accident." "I know," I replied, my gaze level with hers. "That's why I'm still standing." She mentioned that for an architect, I seemed to be building a very dark case against someone. She promised preliminary results by 3, warning that some substances leave very specific architectural footprints in a biological system. As she turned to leave, she paused at the door, her gloved hand holding my future. "By the way," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "another Griffin called earlier inquiring about family health screenings. They were asking for you by name. I felt a cold spike of ice go down my spine. The hunt was already moving into the medical sphere. We'll have the first markers by 3. But Mr. Griffin, be careful. People who use chemistry usually don't stop at 1 dose. I didn't enter my home like a resident. I entered it like a forensic investigator approaching a crime scene that hadn't been cordoned off yet. The heavy brass and marble atmosphere of the bank was still fresh in my mind. But I knew the real battlefield wasn't a vault. It was right here, among the smart lights and interconnected appliances I once called conveniences. I stood in the hallway of Unit 18B listening to the silence of a high-rise condo that suddenly felt like a tomb. Doctor, Stone's warning echoed in my ears. People who use chemistry don't stop at 1 dose. I headed straight for my study, my movements stiff, fueled by a cold, professional fury. I sat before my main console and bypassed the standard user interface, diving straight into the kernel logs of my home network. In software architecture, we call this a man-in-the-middle attack. In families, we just call it the ultimate betrayal. I used my knowledge of the system to hunt for unauthorized pings, searching for data packets that had no business being sent from my private life. That was when I found it. The smart medicine cabinet, a thoughtful health tracking gift from Easton 3 months ago, was a Trojan horse. It was pulsing with activity, quietly transmitting my dosage logs and vital signs to an external IP. You used my own code against me, Easton. Amateur mistake. Let's see where the data leak actually begins. The rhythmic blue flicker of the server rack reflected off my glasses as I traced the route. The external IP didn't lead to a generic medical cloud. It belonged to a pharmaceutical research server Megan frequently uses for her high-end consulting work. The coffee in my hand turned to lead. My own house had been testifying against me for weeks, sending real-time telemetry of my biological functions to the person holding the syringe. Megan wasn't just guessing my cardiac needs. She was monitoring my medication schedule in real time to time the interaction markers perfectly. You weren't just watching me, Megan. You were measuring the exact window for my heart to stop. This was no longer just a son's clumsy greed. It was a daughter-in-law's clinical execution. I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck as I realized the level of sophistication involved. I stood up the chair, scraping harshly against the floor, and moved to the kitchen. The air smelled of ozone and stale coffee, a scent I now associated with a breached perimeter. I opened the cabinet and reached for the backup bottles of my heart medication. Using a high-powered magnification tool I usually reserved for inspecting hardware boards, I leaned over the kitchen island. There, under the harsh light, I saw the microscopic, glinting scratches on the safety seals. They had been tampered with or replaced entirely. Not just 1 dose. Dr. Stone was right. They didn't want a quick death that would trigger a forensic red flag. They wanted a natural failure, a slow-motion heart attack that would look like the inevitable decline of a 68-year-old man under too much stress. I retreated back to the study, my fingers flying across the keys as I initiated a full, deep scan of the home server. I wasn't just patching a leak anymore. I was building a bunker. My pulse was a steady, dangerous rhythm. Now the architect was back in control. That was when I found a hidden folder buried 3 layers deep in a partitioned drive masked as a system update. The title was probate_timeline_final. I opened the properties. The file was created using Megan's credentials 2 weeks before the company sale even finalized. I stared at the microscopic scratches on my pill bottle again, then back at the monitor. It wasn't just a poisoning. It was an execution schedule mapped out with the precision of a software roadmap. And according to the file Megan left behind, the final stage of the process was set. I was supposed to be gone by Friday. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned the same porcelain white as the bank's marble facade. If Megan's schedule was correct, I had exactly 72 hours to become a ghost in the financial system. The discovery of the probate timeline back at the condo had been a system-wide shock, a realization that my own home was a compromised environment. I needed to move fast. I left the car with the valet and stepped through the heavy, imposing doors of First National Bank, feeling the cold air conditioning hit me like a splash of glacial water. I bypassed the standard teller lines, heading directly for the private wealth management wing, where the air smelled of expensive floor wax and old quiet money. Mrs. Roberts, a woman whose pearls were as hard as her financial logic, had managed my millions with a quiet efficiency for 2 decades. She greeted me with a professional smile, but I could see her appraising my weary eyes. We entered her office, and the heavy click of the vault-style door behind us sounded like a final seal. "I need a full sweep, Eleanor," I said, sitting down before her mahogany desk. "Every account, every authorization. I want to know exactly who has the keys to my kingdom." She nodded, her fingers dancing across a keyboard. "Of course, Lance. You've always been meticulous about the architecture of your holdings." I watched the bright white glare of her computer monitor my mind, scanning for vulnerabilities. That was when the first major breach appeared. Eleanor paused, her brow furrowing. "It seems a trusted party designation was added to your primary accounts exactly 1 year ago," she murmured. "It was buried under the routine merger paperwork for Griffin Systems." I felt a cold spike of adrenaline. He designated himself as the fail-safe. "I don't remember signing this." Eleanor scrolled through the digital files. It was in the corporate umbrella renewal packet. Lance. Page 78. Attached to it was a forged medical waiver, a subtle line of text suggesting I was already showing signs of early-onset cognitive decline a year ago. The execution schedule had a legal foundation I had signed off on without ever seeing. In a server farm, a trusted party is a backdoor. If you don't audit your permissions eventually, the guest takes over the root directory. My son had been building a parallel OS inside my life for 12 months. Waiting for the right moment to hit the enter key. The architecture of his betrayal was more sophisticated than I had ever given him credit for. My son didn't just want my money. He wanted my signature on my own death warrant. The realization made the wood-paneled office feel like a shrinking cage. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to an authoritative rasp. "Freeze it all, Eleanor. Now. Revoke every authorization. Transfer the liquid assets into a new partition trust under my sole biometric signature." Eleanor looked at me, her hand hovering over the mouse. "Mr. Griffin, the moment I hit send on this revocation, your son will receive an automated alert. It's part of the security protocol." I didn't hesitate. "Do it. I'd rather he see me coming than watch me die in my sleep." As she worked, the silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the hum of the office HVAC. By freezing these accounts, I was inadvertently triggering a secondary effect, a power reversal. I knew Easton had leveraged his status to secure private loans. The moment this freeze hit, his creditors would be notified that his contingent assets were no longer available. I wasn't just protecting myself. I was pulling the rug out from under his entire deck of cards. Ms. Roberts hit the final key with a sharp, decisive tap. The system processed the request, the progress bar on her screen reaching 100%. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of declared war. "It's done, Lance." she said, her eyes meeting mine with a flicker of genuine concern. But your phone is going to start ringing in exactly 3 seconds. I watched my smartphone spin on the mahogany desk, its vibration a digital growl that shattered the silence Eleanor had just created. It was the first volley of a war I had once hoped was a misunderstanding. The caller ID glowed with a name that used to bring me pride, Easton. I stared at it until the screen went dark, only for the red notification dot to blink a second later, signaling a voicemail. Eleanor Roberts looked at me with a pained expression, her hand still resting near the keyboard that had just dismantled my son's financial leverage. "Let it ring, Eleanor," I said, my voice sounding like dry parchment. "Silence is the only leverage I have left." She nodded slowly, her professional mask finally showing a crack of human empathy. "Be careful, Lance. The system works, but it isn't a shield." I gathered my coat and left the bank, my senses heightened to a degree that bordered on clinical paranoia. Every footstep on the marble floor seemed to echo with the metallic taste of adrenaline. I realized that by freezing the accounts, I had tipped my hand. The text Easton had sent earlier, "Don't do something you'll regret," finally translated in my mind. It wasn't a warning about my financial decisions. It was a coded threat meant to sound like filial concern to any outsider, while reminding me that he held the key to the very chemistry of my survival. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by a brutal race against time. I made it to the parking garage and climbed into the sterile sanctuary of my car. The interior smelled like the expensive cedar and cold, stale coffee I couldn't bring himself to drink. I didn't pull out immediately. I sat there watching the bank exit through the rearview mirror, checking for shadows or familiar silver sedans. Hunger is a biological signal I usually respect, but today my stomach feels like a corrupted sector incapable of processing any input. I tried to eat a turkey sandwich I'd picked up earlier, but the bread felt like dry sponge and the meat tasted like ash. My thoughts drifted to my heart, the biological pump that Griffin Systems had been built to support. It was a weakness I had shared only with family, a set of vulnerabilities now exposed in Megan's execution schedule. I was a software architect who had forgotten to secure his own biological kernel. I spent the next 2 hours in that dim concrete cave, watching the rhythmic flash of a turn signal from a nearby car, feeling the vibration of the steering wheel as other residents came and went. I was waiting for the data to compile. At 3 p.m. sharp, the phone screamed again. I didn't hesitate. Dr. Jennifer Stone's voice was as sharp and sterile as a scalpel when she answered. "Mr. Griffin, we found the cocktail," she said, bypassing any greeting. "High concentrations of benzodiazepine and clear traces of warfarin." I felt the air leave my lungs. She continued with a chilling, professional detachment. "With your heart condition, Lance, this wasn't an attempt to make you sleep. The benzodiazepine was for the haze to keep you confused while the warfarin did the work. It was a plan to stop your heart while you dreamt." Benzodiazepine. Warfarin. The words sounded like a funeral march played on a synthesizer. But there was more. Stone paused, her tone shifting slightly. "The warfarin dosage was specifically calibrated to match a generic version you stopped taking 3 years ago. It wasn't in your digital cloud, Lance. This proves the attacker had access to your old physical medical files." The realization hit me harder than the toxicology report. Someone had been digging through the boxes in my basement, long before the sale was even a whisper in a boardroom. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles cracked the leather, groaning under the pressure. "Thank you, Dr. Stone. Send the full report to Patricia immediately." I ended the call and stared at my own reflection in the rearview mirror. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was the architect of my own survival, and the foundation was already crumbling beneath my feet. $50 million is a heavy weight to move in the dark, but it's nothing compared to the weight of a dead wife's legacy. I walked back into Patricia's office, the air feeling even thinner and colder than it had only a few hours ago. I sat across from Patricia, watching the golden light of the late afternoon hit the expensive mahogany desk in long, slanted bars of amber. I had just finished the call with Dr. Stone, and the clinical proof of lethal intent was still ringing in my ears, like a high-frequency alarm. "Move it all, Patricia," I said, my voice a flat, steady rasp that felt like dry parchment. "I want the accounts emptied before the sun sets." I watched her execute the final series of wire transfers, the rhythmic tapping of her keyboard, the only sound in the wood-paneled room. Each click of her mouse felt like a structural reinforcement, a digital wall rising between my life's work and the son who wanted to inherit it prematurely. "We're creating a blind trust, Lance," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the glowing monitor. "He can't see what he can't touch. Moving money is like rerouting traffic in a high-load network. You don't just stop the flow. You create a decoy path so the system doesn't crash from the sudden change in internal pressure." While the wires processed, I pulled a stack of heavy bond paper toward me and began drafting the foundational documents for the Astor Foundation. The name felt like a prayer whispered into the wind. I explained to Patricia that the choice was for Maria. She always said Astors were about endurance. I said the feel of a fountain pen in my hand, grounding me. They were the ones she said forgave a season by blooming at its very end. I realized this foundation wasn't just a tax shelter or a defensive strategy. It was the only way to ensure my money did the good that Easton never would. I signed the papers with a grim sense of satisfaction. My pulse was steady now, the analytical architect fully back online. This foundation's charter specifically excludes any biological heirs from ever holding a board seat. I added, watching the dark ink sink into the grain of the paper. It was a permanent legal firebreak. Coffee tastes like ash when you are signing away your son's inheritance to save your own life. But I didn't hesitate for a single second. I was building a new legacy, one that Easton's greed could never touch or corrupt. The silence of the office was suddenly shattered by the sharp, persistent ring of Patricia's desk phone. It was Ms. Roberts from First National Bank, her voice tight with an urgency that ignored all professional decorum. "He's at the branch in Naperville, Lance," she said over the speakerphone, her voice crackling with tension. "He's causing a scene trying to override the wire freeze. He's claiming you aren't thinking clearly, and that you're in the middle of a major medical episode." The adrenaline hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The hunt had officially moved from the digital shadows to the physical world. "Tell them to call the police if he doesn't leave immediately," I commanded. The architect is officially out of the office, but Eleanor wasn't finished. "He didn't come to the bank alone, Lance. He brought a man who identified himself as a private care manager. The legal gaslighting was no longer a theory. It was a deployment of a hostile script." I looked at Patricia, the phone still warm in my hand, and the smell of stale office coffee suddenly cloying and heavy. "He's at the bank. He brought someone with him. It's starting." I could feel the cold sweat on the back of my neck, the same one I'd felt in the restaurant. Patricia didn't blink. She just closed the file on her desk with a definitive snap. "Then it's time to find you a place where he can't find the front door. We're going off the grid, Lance. Right now." I watched the paper shredder in the corner of Patricia's office, its rhythmic growl a warning in the world of high-stakes estate planning. If you don't destroy the old paper trail, it eventually becomes your shroud. The sunset over Wacker Drive had been a bleeding streak of crimson, But inside these wood-paneled walls, the atmosphere was as cold and dry as a tomb. I sat across from Patricia, my hands resting on a heavy silver paperweight that felt like an anchor in a storm. We were no longer just building a foundation. We were performing a deep forensic audit of my entire existence. "We need to purge every line, Patricia," I said, my voice cutting through the smell of ozone from the shredder. "If my name is on it, Easton's needs to be gone." "It's a lot of ink to dry, Lance," she replied, her face shadowed by the dimming afternoon light through the office blinds. "We're rewriting 15 years of expectations in 4 hours." As her junior associate brought in a thick folder containing decades of easy trust, the entry twist hit me like a physical blow. Hidden within a corporate umbrella renewal packet I'd signed 2 years ago was a $5 million life insurance policy with a double indemnity clause. A cardiac episode caused by drug interaction would likely trigger that clause, turning my death into a massive windfall. I realized then that the plan wasn't just opportunistic, it was architectural. Have you ever found a price tag on your own life hidden inside a legal document you signed with a smile? It's a very specific kind of nausea. I sat through the grueling review of retirement accounts and brokerage PODs, realizing that almost everything I owned still pointed to Easton. These were the remnants of a father's once unshakable faith, now rendered as vulnerabilities in a compromised system. The paper felt like sandpaper against my fingertips. Every signature was a stitch in a shroud I had been unknowingly sewing for myself. We reached page 78 of the renewal packet, the cloak that had hidden the most lethal part of the betrayal. "I don't remember this," I whispered, staring at the mundane insurance riders. I was focused on the tech exit. Patricia leaned forward, her eyes hard. "That's exactly why he put it there, Lance. He's been waiting for 2 years for your heart to stop." The shock of the premeditation made my pulse pound against my wrist, a rhythmic scratching that matched the sound of my fountain pen as I began to strip him from every policy. I replaced him with the Astor Foundation, each stroke of the nib a tactical strike against the son who had priced my life at $5 million. My own hands were steady, but my mind was a chaotic storm of memories being systematically deleted. Have you ever wondered how many years of love it takes to offset a single afternoon of cold-blooded greed? I didn't have the answer, only the mounting evidence of a long-term hunt. The rhythmic growl of the shredder continued as I fed the old authorizations into its teeth, watching my past become gray confetti. I dropped the pen. The ink was still wet, but the man I called my son was already dead to me. There was a grim finality to the silence that followed a death of hope that no legal document could ever fully repair. I was operating in pure survival architecture mode, now numb to the pain but hypersensitive to the danger. Patricia looked at the signature on page 79, the secondary witness line that I had previously ignored, and turned the folder toward me with a slow, deliberate motion. "Look at the witness line on the insurance policy, Lance," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. "It isn't Easton's signature. It belongs to the care manager from the bank. The conspirators have been a team for a long time." I stared at the name, the cold weight of the silver paperweight finally matching the ice in my veins. The trap wasn't just a family affair. It was a professional execution. A high-rise condo in Chicago is supposed to be a fortress of glass and steel, but tonight, my home felt like a glass trap where the predator had a copy of the blueprints. I drove away from Patricia's office as the city lights began to blur into streaks of artificial neon. Every shadow in my rearview mirror looked like a tail, every headlight a threat. I needed a sanctuary, but not one linked to my name. I chose the Riverside Inn, a mid-range hotel, where the carpeting smelled of industrial cleaner, and the air was recycled through vents that had seen better decades. It was the kind of place a man of my standing wouldn't be caught dead, in which was exactly the point. I checked in under the name Arthur Miller, my grandfather's name, hoping the thin layer of pseudonymity would hold. Room 412. Quiet side of the building, please. I told the clerk, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. I'm just a man looking for a night of uninterrupted sleep. But as I handed over my credit card for the deposit, a chill settled in my marrow. I was a refugee in my own city, hunted by the very person I had built my legacy for, and I was leaving a digital breadcrumb with every transaction. I retreated to the room, the low hum of the mini-fridge providing a lonely soundtrack to my paranoia. I sat on the edge of the polyester bedspread and opened my tablet connecting to the encrypted Riverside Towers security feed. The screen flared to life with the bluish tint of the night vision cameras. I watched the lobby and my own hallway, with the intensity of a hawk, my pulse drumming a frantic rhythm in my ears. A vibration in my hand signaled a text from Patricia. She had confirmed the identity of the witness on that hidden $5 million insurance policy. It was the care manager Easton had brought to the bank. The circle was closing. They were working together, a medical trap, a legal gaslighting campaign, and a financial execution, all synchronized with terrifying precision. Have you ever watched your own front door through a digital lens and felt like a trespasser in your own life? It is a unique form of violation. At 1:30 a.m., the hallway camera triggered. I felt the sharp spike of adrenaline before I even saw his face. Easton appeared, his features distorted by the wide-angle lens accompanied by a man carrying a heavy professional locksmith's bag. I realized then that the locksmith wasn't just there to open a door. Easton was trying to plant evidence of my incompetence, perhaps staged medication or forged notes, inside the condo before the guardianship hearing could even be contested. Click. The locksmith's tool met the steel plate. It sounded like a bone snapping through the tablet's speakers. I didn't hesitate. I called the building's security desk, my voice a low, dangerous rasp. Anderson, look at the monitor for 18B. My son is trying to breach the unit with a locksmith. Stop them. Now. I watched the screen as two uniformed guards rounded the corner. Tell him if he stays one more minute, the Chicago PD will be there for the arrest, I barked into the phone. The confrontation was brief, but jagged. Easton's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage as he was forced back toward the elevator. But just before the doors closed, he turned and looked directly into the doorbell camera. He didn't shout. He didn't struggle. He simply mouthed 4 words. I know where you used your card, Dad. A cold spike of ice went through my chest. My pseudonym had been a paper shield against a credit card transaction alert. I stared at the screen as he vanished. He didn't look defeated. He looked like he was just changing the coordinates of the hunt. My phone pinged a transaction alert from the Riverside Inn. He hadn't found me through luck. He had followed the money, and now he was coming for the source. I didn't wait for the elevator. I began packing my bag in the dark of room 412, my movements mechanical and efficient. The digital notification on my phone earlier had been a beacon for the predator, a trail of breadcrumbs I had inadvertently dropped in the middle of a dark forest. I didn't reach for the light when the knock finally came sharp and insistent. In the oppressive silence of the hotel room, the sound was as heavy as a hammer hitting a coffin nail, vibrating through the thin carpet and into my bones. I stood perfectly still, watching the distorted image on the door's fisheye lens. Easton was alone, looking disheveled. His tie loosened as if the frantic pressure of the hunt were finally fraying his own nerves. Dad, open up. Please, we just need to talk. His voice came through the heavy, solid wood, muffled but saturated with a manufactured desperation. I leaned my forehead against the cool surface of the door, but I didn't reach for the deadbolt. Say it where the cameras hear you, Easton. I said, my voice a low, lethal rasp. I was holding my tablet, the recording software already capturing every decibel. Through the wood, he begged for an off-the-record talk, claiming he was just worried about my health. It was Warfarin Easton. That's a very specific mistake for a man who says he just wanted me to sleep. There was a sharp, jagged silence on the other side. I realized then that his disheveled look was partially staged. He wasn't there to apologize. He was checking the response time of my brain, looking for the cognitive confusion the drug was supposed to induce. He was testing his malware on a biological host. Have you ever looked at your own child through a fisheye lens and seen a stranger? It distorts more than just the face. It reveals the predatory curvature of a soul you once thought you knew. Eventually, I saw the shadow of Megan arrive in the hall, her hand on his shoulder pulling a broken Easton back toward the stairwell. I didn't breathe until the hallway was empty, and the blue-tinted feed showed them gone. I sat on the edge of the bed and began the digital blackout. No more card trails. I am going ghost. I called Patricia to announce the change. The architecture has to change, Patricia. They found me through the bank alert. I'm switching to cash only from here on out. I discarded my phone, the screen flickering once before I plunged it into a glass of lukewarm water. I spent the remaining hours in a state of hypervigilance, the room feeling like a concrete bunker. As dawn broke over the Chicago River, casting a gray filtered light through the dusty blinds, I reached for the sealed envelope I had retrieved from the condo's hidden safe. It was the letter Maria wrote before her final surgery. The sound of paper tearing with surgical precision was the only noise in the room. Her words provided the ultimate validation, a message from the past that felt like a critical patch for a corrupted heart. Lance, protect yourself even from our son, she had written in her elegant script. She saw the rot in him years ago, a memory of a boy replaced by a calculation. The tears didn't feel like weakness. They felt like a system purge, clearing out the last of the denial that had kept my fire brakes from closing properly. I wept for the woman who saw the truth, and for the man I had to become to honor her memory. I taught you to ride a bike, Easton. Now I will teach you about walls. Maria's letter revealed one final secret. She had set up a secondary hidden security trigger in the family's estate that only I could activate. It was her final gift, a kill switch for the inheritance Easton so desperately craved. I wiped my eyes and strapped on Maria's leather-banded watch, the cold weight of the metal watch buckle a reminder of the time I had left. The sun was up, the shadows were gone, and I finally knew exactly how many fire breaks I had to build before sunset. I sat in a booth that smelled of grease and cheap floor wax, watching Patricia slide a manila folder across the table like a dealer passing a losing hand. In the shadows of this diner, $50 million felt like a fever dream. But the threat in that folder was cold and very real. I had spent the dawn hours discarding my digital self, moving through the streets of Chicago like a ghost. But the physical reality of the betrayal was catching up to me. The yellowed, sticky texture of the diner menu under my palm served as a grounding wire. I didn't hire you to find a tragic backstory, Patricia, I said, my voice barely a whisper over the distant rumble of a passing truck. I hired you for armor. She wasn't always a Griffin Lance. She was a Carter, and the Carters lost everything. Patricia replied, her eyes fixed on the grainy black and white photocopy of an old newspaper clipping she had pulled from the file. I leaned in my analytical mind, instantly mapping the data points. Megan's maiden name was Megan Carter. Her father, Thomas Carter, had owned a small logistics firm that was dismantled by a fraudulent acquisition when Megan was just 12 years old. The entry twist hit me with the force of an unhandled exception. The fraudulent firm that destroyed her family was a distant subsidiary of the very conglomerate that had just bought Griffin Systems. For Megan, this acquisition wasn't just a payday. It was a full-circle trauma. A wounded animal is more dangerous than a hungry one. Hunger wants a meal. Fear wants to ensure the threat never comes back. I looked at the file, seeing the history of a move to a cramped one-bedroom apartment and the crushing weight of public shame. Thomas Carter had eventually taken his own life when Megan was 16. Suddenly, her pharmaceutical career made sense. It wasn't a vocation. It was a tool for absolute biological control. Her obsession with my exit proceeds was a desperate, lethal attempt to outrun the ghost of her father's poverty. 16. That is the age she was when she found him. I was 16 when I wrote my first line of clean code. Different worlds. Different architectures of the soul. I felt a fleeting moment of pity, a biological response I quickly suppressed. Her trauma explained the why, but it didn't excuse the warfarin in my glass or the monitoring software in my medicine cabinet. Hurt people hurt people. Lance Patricia said, tapping her pen against the table. But you aren't a therapeutic exercise. You're a target. You need to remember that fear makes people capable of things even greed can't conceive. I processed the data through my architect lens. While Megan's motivation was rooted in a profound terror of loss, she had become a compromised component in my life system. In any high-availability network, once a component is identified as malicious, it must be quarantined. There is no middle ground. We proceed with the lockdown. I said, the cold, metallic taste of fear finally being replaced by a grim resolve. I understand the motivation now, but the execution remains the same. We prepare the terms for the ultimatum. Patricia closed the folder, the heavy thud echoing in the quiet diner like the closing of a vault. The smell of burnt coffee and old oil seemed to intensify as she leaned forward, her expression turning even darker. There is something else about that care manager, Lance. You thought he was Easton's man, a tool for a messy bank confrontation. He wasn't hired by your son. He was hired by Megan 6 months before the acquisition talks even began. She hasn't just been following the money. She's been secretly corresponding with him to draft a preemptive psychiatric hold on you. She wanted to stop the deal entirely if she couldn't control the outcome. She wasn't just waiting for you to die. She was preparing to bury you alive in a ward. I watched Patricia fan out the documents on her conference table like a dealer preparing for the highest-stakes game in Chicago. The evidence was all there laid out in cold, unblinking black and white. We spent the afternoon mapping the evidence on Patricia's conference table like a war room, transforming the wood-paneled office into a command center for a counterinsurgency. This isn't a family drama anymore. Lance Patricia said, her voice cutting through the clinical hum of the office HVAC. It is a crime scene. I adjusted my glasses, my analytical detachment, finally meeting her grim vindication. We organized the gathered data points with surgical precision, the toxicology lab results from Dr. Stone, the sharp infrared doorbell camera footage, the secret $5 million insurance policy, and the incriminating digital trail Megan left on my home server. We treated the table like a map of a digital fortress that had been breached, identifying exactly where the firewalls of my life had failed. We are not just proving what they did, I replied, my voice a steady rasp. We are proving they spent years planning it. I watched Patricia prepare the 2 white envelopes. Envelope A was the kill shot. It contained a formal criminal complaint to the Chicago PD and a request for immediate arrest. Envelope B was the architecture of a new, albeit hollow, reality. It held a binding restrictive covenant, a spendthrift trust, a mandatory year of psychiatric evaluation under Dr. Sandra Mitchell, and a permanent ban from my properties. I revealed that Envelope B also included a pre-signed confession of their financial fraud, a dead man's switch that would trigger Envelope A automatically if they ever violated the therapy terms. A spendthrift trust is like a sandbox. You let them play, but you build the walls so high they can't see the real world outside. It was a cold, necessary containment of a compromised system. A is justice. I murmured, the crisp sound of heavy bond paper echoing in the room. B is architecture. Patricia looked at me with a gaze that held no pity, only a shared understanding of the stakes. If they choose B, they are not your children anymore. They are beneficiaries under supervision. The sharp ticking of a wall clock counted down the minutes, marking the death of my former life. Patricia forced me to practice my responses, coaching me to stay in debug mode, cold, clinical, and unresponsive to emotional manipulation. I stared at my reflection in the glass, the cold reflection of the river in the window matching the gray of my soul. To survive tonight, I had to kill the part of myself that still searched for a misunderstanding. I felt Maria's watch on my wrist, the weight of the leather a physical anchor to my resolve. I am not going there to talk to my son, I told her, feeling the complete suppression of paternal instinct. I am going there to close a ticket. If you blink, Easton will find the weakness, Patricia warned. If you cry, Megan will exploit the guilt. She reached for the sealing wax, the smell of mahogany and heat filling the air. Click. The wax seal on envelope A hit the paper. It felt like the drop of a guillotine. The physical sealing of the two envelopes was the final act of preparation before the endgame began. Patricia noted that the care manager Megan hired was already waiting at the terrace, likely prepared to commit me the moment I showed even a hint of the confusion Easton was banking on. I picked up the two envelopes. They felt light in my hand, but I knew they contained the kinetic energy to destroy a family or rebuild a fortress. Patricia checked her watch, her expression hard and final. It's time, Lance. Aaron is waiting. I tucked the envelopes into my inner jacket pocket. The heavy bond paper, a shield against the man who carried my blood. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of the final move. Aaron Platt didn't walk into the room. He marched into it with the rigid posture of a man who had already decided his soul wasn't for sale. He looked at the two envelopes on the desk, and then at me, his eyes reflecting a shared, bitter understanding. The elevator ride down had felt like a descent into a combat zone, but seeing Aaron here, solid and unyielding, felt like the final calibration of a complex machine. We stood around Patricia's desk, the sterile hum of the tablet battery, the only sound against the backdrop of a city beginning to glow with artificial light. I opened the surveillance folder, and we began the witness sync. Aaron's finger traced the screen, pausing at the exact moment Easton's sleeve brushed the wine glass. There, he set his voice low. He used his left hand to block the line of sight from the other tables, while his right hand hovered over your drink. It was a detail I had missed in my initial grief-stricken viewing. Aaron then revealed he had managed to record a 10-second snippet on his personal phone before approaching me at the restaurant, providing a backup angle the house cameras had missed. You did what was right, Aaron. I told him, a heavy sense of professional solidarity settling between us. Not just for me, but for the truth. We synchronized our movements for the evening, ensuring Aaron's approach would happen at the precise millisecond The digital evidence was presented to maximize the psychological impact. I spent the next hour in a state of technological obsession, preparing the tablet that would serve as our judge and jury. I loaded the high-definition footage, the lab reports from Dr. Stone and those hidden insurance riders. I checked the battery life 3 times, treating the device with the same reverence I once gave my most critical server deployments. A dry run is like a beta test. You find the edge cases before the users can break the interface. Tonight, Easton is the user, and I am the architect of his crash. I looked at Patricia, who was checking the timestamp on the finalized documents. If the tech fails, the momentum dies, I muttered. I won't let it crash. It's ready, Lance, she replied, her eyes sharp. The evidence is compiled. The code is clean. Before I expose the truth behind the hidden insurance policy, are you still following along? Comment A, if you think Easton deserves the full criminal complaint, or B, if the trust is enough. And add one short reason so I can understand your thinking. Please note this story includes fictional and dramatized elements for educational purposes, but the message is what I hope stays with you. If you're not comfortable with dramatized details, this is a good place to stop. The sun began to set over Chicago, a bleeding streak of orange and purple as we prepared to leave for the terrace. Patricia handed me the 2 envelopes one last time, their weight heavy against my chest. I felt the cold metal of Maria's watch on my wrist, a physical anchor reminding me that the next 60 minutes would determine whether I was a free man or a permanent victim. 6:15 p.m. The elevator chimed. It sounded like a bell at the start of a fight. We stepped out into the hallway, the air heavy with the scent of rain on the Chicago asphalt below, and the rhythmic tapping of Patricia's heels on the marble floor. Desperation has no better ideas, Patricia, I said, as we moved toward the exit. They'll be there. I looked at the tablet screen one last time and saw a faint recent login from a location near the restaurant. Megan was already in position, checking the system status of the trap she thought was still active. They were waiting for a man who didn't exist anymore. I tucked the envelopes into my jacket, adjusted my cuffs, and stepped into the light to close this ticket. The terrace at Riverside was exactly as I remembered it, but the air felt different tonight. Heavier, charged with a static tension that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. I arrived 15 minutes early at 6:45 p.m. to secure the perimeter. I chose the same table as before, the one by the railing, where the Chicago River looks like a dark, flowing bruise under the lantern light. This time I wasn't the guest of honor. I was the architect of a controlled demolition. I had Aaron Platt adjust the table's lighting earlier in the day, ensuring the overhead spots were angled away, so the tablet's screen would have zero glare. I needed the evidence to be impossible to look away from a high-contrast reality they couldn't ignore. I ordered a glass of sparkling water, just the water, Aaron, I said to my friend when I saw him near the bar. I need my head clear for the audit. I placed the 2 white envelopes and the digital tablet in a neat clinical line on the crisp white tablecloth. The jazz trio was already playing, but the melody was different tonight. A somber, rhythmic, bass-heavy piece that felt less like celebration and more like a requiem. I sat and watched the dark water churn below, feeling a cold, calculated calm. I was a predator waiting in the open, and the trap was already armed. Easton and Megan arrived at 7:02 p.m. I watched them walk toward the table, their faces set into practiced masks of feigned concern. Megan was carrying a leather-bound notebook, no doubt her care plan for my alleged cognitive decline, while Easton had that familiar, practiced slouch of underlying irritation. He tried to initiate a familiar greeting, reaching out as if to pat my shoulder. Dad, thank God, he began, his voice pitch perfect for a worried son. We've been worried sick about your erratic behavior since you disappeared from the hotel. I didn't move. My icy gaze caught his, stopping him mid-stride. "Sit down, Easton," I said, the authority in my voice a physical barrier. "This isn't a family dinner. It's a board meeting." The power shift was immediate. I saw the slight flicker in his eyes the moment his script began to unravel. A restaurant is just a user interface. It looks pretty on the surface, but I was looking at the messy, corrupted code running underneath the tablecloth. Megan took her seat, her movements stiff. She didn't look at me. She looked at the tablet. Before they could launch into their rehearsed gaslighting, I reached out and tapped the device. I didn't say a word, letting the silence of our table contrast sharply with the rhythmic bass of the jazz trio. I slid the blue, sterile glow of the screen into the center of the table. "You wanted to talk about stability, Easton. Let's look at the frame rates." Play. The video didn't stutter. Neither did my resolve. It was 4K security footage from 4 nights ago, perfectly preserved and unblinking. We watched in silence as the digital version of Easton leaned over. His hand moved toward my wine glass with a practiced, predatory smoothness. The footage was so clear I could see the sweat on his brow. As the video played, I didn't watch the screen. I watched them. Megan's first instinct wasn't to gasp or look at her husband in shock. Instead, her hand went to her purse, her eyes darting toward her own phone. She was checking the system status, seeing if her care manager was in position to commit me the moment this dinner turned south. The smell of expensive perfume was suddenly overtaken by the sharp, sour scent of sudden sweat. I watched the color drain from Easton's face, leaving it the same hollow gray as the Chicago fog. Megan's hand went to her throat, her fingers trembling. I didn't blink. I let the evidence sit there, a digital ghost between us. "That's 4K resolution, Easton. Would you like to see the lab reports next, or should we just skip straight to the insurance policy? Silence is a weapon if you know how to hold it." I let the tablet screen hum between us. The pixels of my son's betrayal frozen in 4K resolution. I watched the light from the overhead lanterns bounce off Easton's sweating forehead, turning his skin into a greasy, pale canvas of panic. Megan remained eerily still, though her eyes kept darting toward the bar. She was looking for the care manager she had hired to commit me, but I had already anticipated that move. I leaned forward slightly, enjoying the sharp chemical smell of her rising fear. "I already knew about your shadow in the corner," I said, my voice a clinical rasp that cut through the jazz saxophone drifting in the background. "I had the restaurant security escort your doctor friend off the premises 5 minutes before you arrived. You're alone at this table." Easton attempted to stammer through a defense, his words tripping over each other in a desperate race to nowhere. "Dad, that's not... The lighting is weird in this place," he wheezed. "I was just reaching for the salt, or maybe I was checking the vintage. It's a digital hallucination." I didn't blink. "You were reaching for my grave, Easton. Don't lie to the man who built the very systems you use to breathe." My impassive silence was the heavy, humid air of the riverfront itself, forcing him to dig a deeper hole with every inconsistent lie he spat out. "Do you know what a $5 million lie smells like? It smells like expensive perfume and cold, sharp sweat." I tapped the screen, shifting the digital feed from the video to a high-resolution scan of the secret insurance policy. I highlighted the trusted party designation and the witness signature in a glowing red box. Megan's posture broke for the first time. The rigid pharmaceutical-grade composure she wore like armor began to flake away. $5 million, Megan, I murmured. "That is a lot of money for a daughter-in-law who claimed she just wanted me to rest." Takitri, I explained the double indemnity clause for accidental death. Watching the realization sink in, that I had dismantled their entire architectural plan. It wasn't just greed, Lance, she whispered, her voice trembling. We had debts, real ones. I didn't offer a drop of sympathy. Greed is a debt that can never be paid, Megan. Checkmate. The word didn't need to be said. It was written in the way Easton's jaw hung slack, his eyes fixed on the evidence he thought I'd never find. I raised a hand, a small, decisive signal to the shadows. Aaron Platt approached the table, his uniform crisp, and his gaze as unwavering as a line of perfect code. He stood beside me, a living, breathing firewall. I witnessed the drop, mister. Griffin Aaron said, his voice carrying the weight of a sworn oath. And I witnessed the intent. You're just a waiter! Easton hissed, his desperation turning into a pathetic, high-pitched sneer. No one will believe a servant over family Aaron didn't flinch. He stated clearly that he had already signed a sworn affidavit for Patricia Coleman. He added a detail that made Megan's face turn a translucent shade of white. Easton hadn't just dropped a pill. He had used a specialized micro-dropper Megan had provided from her own lab. It was a professional-grade execution attempt, not an opportunistic accident. Easton lunged for the tablet in a sudden, violent burst of movement, but Aaron was faster. He pinned the device to the table with a gloved hand, the metal of the tablet clinking against the wood. I didn't move a muscle. I just reached into my jacket and pulled out the 2 white envelopes, placing them on the tablecloth like 2 slabs of white marble. The cold, smooth surface of the screen still glowed between us, a digital judge. Now I whispered, my voice as cold as the river below. You choose between a felony and a firewall. Choose carefully, because I've already deleted the father you think you know. I placed the 2 envelopes on the white linen like 2 slabs of cold marble. One was a ticket to a prison cell. The other was a blueprint for a life under total surveillance. The crisp texture of the heavy bond paper felt cold beneath my fingertips, a physical manifestation of the boundary I was drawing between us. I watched the dark, rhythmic flow of the Chicago River below us, its surface churning with a restlessness that matched the feral desperation in Easton's eyes. Envelope A is the felony. I said, my voice as unyielding as the concrete pylons beneath the terrace. Envelope B is the firewall. You have exactly 6 minutes to choose. I checked Maria's watch with cold precision, the rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the needle, a countdown to the end of their freedom. You'd put your own son in a cage. Lance Easton hissed, the sound of his chair scraping back in defeat echoing against the brickwork. I didn't flinch. You already tried to put me in a coffin, Easton. Don't talk to me about cages. The father role was dead. The architect was now in full control of the environment. I explained the conditions of Envelope B, a strict spendthrift trust, 52 weeks of verified therapy, and a total loss of financial control. What I didn't tell them immediately was that the therapy was with a forensic psychologist who specializes in criminal sociopathy. They wouldn't be receiving comfort. They would be under constant mental evaluation. 7:54. The deadline hit. The air in the restaurant felt like it had been sucked out of a vacuum. Easton and Megan exchanged looks of sharp, jagged panic. Megan was the first to crack her eyes, darting toward the exit where she finally accepted that her care manager wasn't coming to save her. She whispered something to Easton, a frantic, desperate plea for survival. Easton finally reached for Envelope B, his hands trembling so violently he nearly knocked over the water glass. We'll do B, he wheezed the words, sounding like they were being dragged over broken glass. We'll take the therapy. Just keep the police out of this. I stared at him, until he looked away, ensuring the humiliation was absolute. Say it clearly, Easton. You choose the boundaries. I choose the boundaries, he repeated, his voice small and hollow. Aaron remained a silent, upright witness behind me, the physical proof that their denial had no standing here. I reached into the center of the table, took a single dry bite of bread, and stood up. It was a symbolic gesture of victory, the first sustenance I had allowed myself to enjoy in days. The smell of expensive bread mixed with a sudden sharp scent of ozone as a distant storm began to roll over the lake. 9 a.m. Patricia's office. I commanded, my voice resonating with an authority that left no room for negotiation. Bring a pen. Don't bring your excuses. I'm not your father tonight. I'm just the one who owns the house you live in. I left them there, 2 glitches in a system I had finally patched. They looked small under the expensive lanterns, stripped of their predatory glamour, and reduced to mere beneficiaries under supervision. I walked toward the exit, my heels clicking against the stone floor with a steady architectural rhythm. I spotted the floor captain near the podium and handed him a cash tip. It was the exact amount Easton had spent on the poisoned bottle of wine 4 nights ago. A systematic return of dirty money to the universe, a way of starting fresh and purging the corruption from my world. I stepped out into the cool night air of Chicago, leaving the jazz music and the broken couple behind. The river air was sharp and smelled of rain. I was alive, I was wealthy, and I was entirely alone. I checked Maria's watch one last time as I reached the sidewalk. The first day of the rest of my life had officially begun. The sunlight in Patricia's office was too bright for the mood reflecting off the mahogany desk, like a clinical spotlight on a fresh surgical scar. I sat there at 8:58, watching the second hand sweep toward the moment my son would officially become a stranger. The sharp chemical smell of fresh laser-printed ink hung heavy in the air, a scent that now signaled the end of my life as a patriarch and the beginning of my role as a warden. I adjusted my cuffs, feeling the weight of Maria's watch on my wrist. It was my only anchor in a room that felt increasingly like a vacuum. Easton and Megan arrived at exactly 9 a.m. They looked as though they hadn't slept, their clothes slightly rumpled, the previous night's arrogance replaced by a sullen, hollow compliance. They weren't greeted by a father today. They were greeted by a notary, a man with a jaw like a vice and eyes that had seen too many crime scenes to be fooled by a suit who sat silently in the corner. I had already informed Patricia that the notary was actually a former police detective turned private investigator. Every signature today was being watched by a professional eye that knew exactly what guilt looked like when it tried to hold a pen. "You're on time," I said, my voice as cold as the morning air. "Compliance is a good start." Easton didn't meet my gaze. "We're here, Dad. Let's just get this over with." Patricia didn't waste time. She played the full 4K security footage on the large wall monitor, ensuring the notary witnessed their silent acknowledgement of the events. A legal contract is just a set of permissions. I was finally revoking the admin rights my son had enjoyed for 38 years. Megan looked away from the monitor, her face pale as she watched her own clinical participation in the poisoning attempt. But Easton just stared at the floor, his shoulders hunched. They began the rhythmic scratching of a fountain pen on heavy bond paper, signing the restrictive covenants and the spendthrift trust terms. They were signing away their financial adulthood, shackling themselves to a mandatory therapy agreement with Dr. Sandra Mitchell. By signing this, you acknowledge the evidence and waive your right to contest the trust structure. Patricia stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "I understand," Easton whispered. "I just need this to be quiet." The ink was black, The paper was white. The relationship was dead. I felt a grim sense of finality as the last document was stamped. When the paperwork was filed, I slid a heavy sealed envelope across the mahogany toward Easton. "This is from your mother," I said. It was the letter Maria had left for him, the one I had agonized over for days. I set the condition, with a tone that brooked no argument. It was not to be opened for 6 months, pending a successful report from the therapist. If you break the seal before March. Envelope A is filed within the hour. Easton held the envelope like it weighed 100 pounds. His fingers tracing the wax seal as if it were the last piece of his mother he would ever touch. "I'm sorry, Lance. I truly am." Megan offered her voice, sounding thin and hollow in the clinical glare of the morning sun. "I heard you the first time, Megan. The door is that way." I watched the door click shut with a finality that echoed in my chest. I watched them go, 2 ghosts leaving a graveyard of their own making. Patricia looked at me, her expression unreadable as she gathered the signed stipulations. "It's done, Lance, but the architecture of a secret like this usually has a secondary foundation we haven't found yet." She revealed that she had already secured the original micro-dropper from the restaurant as physical evidence. Even if they tried to contest the video later, the forensics were locked in a safe. The war was over, but the audit was just beginning. I spent the next week inside my own server logs hunting for ghosts. In my world, a quiet system isn't necessarily a secure one. It's often just a system where the intruder has learned to breathe in sync with the host. I retreated to my home office at Riverside Towers, the rhythmic blue flicker of the server rack, providing the only illumination in a room that suddenly felt far too large. The silence of my high-rise condo was heavy and absolute, yet the digital logs told a much noisier story of violation. I utilized high-level administrative tools to trace every ping to my private network over the last 6 months. That was when I found the first major breach. My smart medicine cabinet, the thoughtful birthday gift from Easton, had been quietly transmitting my dosage times and heart rate data to an external encrypted server since the moment it was plugged in. "You weren't just checking on me, Easton. You were measuring the cadence of my decline. Every pill I took was a data point for your timeline." The realization brought a cold, clinical anger that tasted of ozone and stale coffee. My own home had been testifying against my health for half a year, reporting my biological rhythm to the people holding the needle. I didn't stop at the local network. I pushed further, digging into the logs of my patient portal at Chicago General. I discovered multiple failed and 2 successful login attempts with IP addresses, tracing directly back to Megan's pharmaceutical consulting firm. HePay is supposed to be the great wall of medical privacy. But Megan didn't try to climb it. She used her professional credentials to walk right through the gate like she owned the place. She wasn't just guessing my medication interactions. She was hunting for a specific vulnerability in my blood chemistry. I stared at the cold, smooth glass of the tablet screen as a mid-log twist surfaced. Megan hadn't just looked at my prescriptions. She had attempted to suggest a medication change to my pharmacy by forging my doctor's digital signature. The change would have increased my dosage to a lethal level, a move only stopped by a routine verification call from a pharmacist that I had completely missed while I was focused on the tech exit. Pharmaceutical regulatory consultant by day and professional data thief by night. The sheer professionalism of the attempted murder was a system error I hadn't accounted for. Click. Another unauthorized access found. Another layer of my trust stripped away like old paint. I felt a dull ache in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition and everything to do with the logs I found next. Easton hadn't just been watching the data. He had been accessing the condo's audio logs. He had been listening to my private conversations with Maria's photo, using my grief and my moments of perceived weakness to time the intervention of that care manager. He knew exactly when I was most vulnerable, because he was eavesdropping on my soul through the very walls of my sanctuary. I reached for my phone and contacted the hospital's IT security and legal department. I need a full log of every access to my records since January. Every single one. I told the manager, my voice as hard as the lead-lined safe I was about to order for my medications. I spent the rest of the day methodically resetting every biometric lock in the unit. I ripped the smart cabinet from the wall, replacing it with a manual analog vault. I'm not just patching a leak anymore. I'm building a bunker. I stared at the timestamp of the last successful breach. It was the night before our final dinner at the terrace. They didn't just want to kill me. They wanted to make sure the state would call it a predictable medical event. My own house had been a witness for the prosecution, and now it was time to wipe the drive clean forever. I needed to see something that didn't have a login requirement or a biometric sensor. I needed to see if Maria's belief in human goodness was still a viable piece of code in this city, or if the corruption I had found in my own bloodline had infected every sector of my world. I drove to the west side, leaving the sterile glass and steel silence of Riverside Towers behind for the dusty, raw reality of the city streets. I found myself at the Green Corner, a community pantry and garden that Maria used to mention in the quiet, reflective hours of the night. Claire, a woman in her late 50s with soil under her fingernails and a smile that seemed to have been forged in the sun, wiped her hands on her apron before taking mine. The smell of damp earth and compost was thick here, a stark grounding contrast to the faint smell of ozone and digital betrayal that had haunted my study for weeks. Maria always talked about this place. I said, my voice sounding more human than it had in months. She said, you grew hope where others saw only concrete. Claire chuckled, her eyes holding a weary kindness as she adjusted a rough burlap sack, leaning against a vibrant community mural. We just grow what we can, Mr. Griffin. Sometimes that's asters. Sometimes it's just dinner. I felt the digital ice around my heart begin to thaw as she revealed that Maria had been making secret monthly donations from a private account I never audited. My wife had been building this legacy long before I realized I needed a sanctuary. A community garden is a decentralized network, no single point of failure. If the drought hits one bed, the others carry the load. It's the most resilient architecture I've ever seen, far more robust than the centralized systems of greed I had been defending. I walked with Claire to her small, cramped office, the rough texture of a burlap sack brushing my leg as we passed the rows of winter squash. I presented her with the first official grant from the Astor Foundation. It wasn't just a check for the books. It was a commitment to a multi-year tree planting initiative across the entire district. This is for the Oaks. Claire, I told her, my hands steady as I slid the documents over. And the Astors. She looked at the signature, and the quiet joy on her face gave me a sense of purpose that no $50 million exit could ever match. You're not just giving us money, Lance. You're giving this neighborhood a different future, she whispered. I finally understood that my legacy wasn't the software I had sold, but the shade these trees would provide for people I would never meet. I returned home as the October wind began to rattle the glass of my balcony, bringing the sound of dry leaves skittering across the concrete. I went to the bedroom and performed the final physical act of my transition. I installed a new, safe mechanical heavy and decoupled from any network. It was a cold, analog beast in a digital world, an island of absolute security. Clack. The safe door bit into the frame. The sound was a final period at the end of a long, dark sentence. I placed Maria's remaining jewelry and my private journals inside the items finally secure from any remote breach or electronic ghost. As I set the combination, I used a sequence of numbers from a childhood memory involving my grandfather's old boat, a series of integers Easton could never guess or intercept. "The fire breaks are holding Maria," I whispered to her photo. "We're blooming at the end. Safe." Finally, I went to bed in a house that was finally honest, the architecture of my life stable and fortified against the hunt. I looked out at the Chicago skyline, the lights twinkling like millions of data points across the dark expanse. For the first time in months, I wasn't looking for a threat. I was looking for the spaces where the trees would go. But in the quiet, I couldn't help but wonder, was the peace a permanent installation or just a temporary patch? The peace didn't break with a bang. It broke with the shrill, persistent vibration of my phone on a cold February morning, cutting through the silence of 5 months of hard-won safety. Winter in Chicago has a way of stripping everything down to the skeleton, and as I reached for the device, the sharp, cold air of the bedroom felt like a premonition. I was jolted awake at 6 a.m. by a call from Jonathan Wells. Jonathan Wells, the CEO, who had bought my company and my friend for 20 years, sounded like he was standing on a sinking ship. His voice, usually the epitome of boardroom composure, was thin and rattled. "Lance, tell me you haven't seen the Business Insider piece yet," he blurted out. I sat up, the metallic taste of morning adrenaline coating my tongue. "It's 6 in the morning, Jonathan. I was dreaming about oak trees for the foundation, not headlines." "Tell me what happened." He didn't have to. I pulled up my tablet, the blue-white glare of the screen punishing my eyes in the dark room. The headline was a surgical strike designed to bypass every firewall I'd built. Silicon and senility, the secret decline of a tech pioneer. I felt the old adrenaline, the kind that comes from a system-wide crash, return to my veins with a vengeance. The article included grainy photos of my secret check-in at the Riverside Inn from 5 months ago. It proved that Easton hadn't just been defeated that night. He had been sitting on this evidence of my erratic behavior, waiting for the winter frost to settle before turning it into a weapon. Have you ever seen your own life story rewritten as a medical chart by someone who wants your grave to be profitable? It's a very specific kind of ghost story. I moved to my study, the rhythmic thumping of my own heart against my ribs sounding like a drumbeat for a march I hadn't signed up for. The piece claimed I was suffering from advanced dementia and paranoid delusions, all sourced from a concerned, close family member. "Concerned family member," I whispered to the empty room. "You mean the one who tried to poison my Cabernet and now wants to poison my reputation?" They weren't attacking my wealth anymore. They were attacking my reality, painting my security measures as symptoms of a mental breakdown rather than a defense against their own betrayal. The words on the screen were like a virus in the boot sector. If I didn't purge them now, the entire legacy would be corrupted beyond repair. I realized the strategic depth of the move as I scrolled further. By framing me as mentally unfit, they weren't just seeking revenge. They were aiming for a court-mandated guardianship. Such a move would invalidate the Spendthrift Trust and the Astor Foundation's charter in one fell swoop. They were using my own logic about architecture and security to dismantle me, twisting my words into evidence of clinical paranoia. I looked out the window at the Chicago skyline. The winter light was gray and unforgiving, making the shadows of the skyscrapers look like prison bars across the city. I didn't just build a foundation, I built a target. The article even mentioned a preliminary psychiatric filing already submitted to the Cook County Court. The legal gaslighting wasn't a threat anymore. It was an active process that had been running in the background while I was busy planting trees. I stared at the black and white photo they'd used me looking weary and disheveled at the hotel lobby. Underneath it, the caption read, "A pioneer lost in his own mind." The silence of my high-rise condo suddenly felt incredibly vulnerable, as if the walls had turned to glass. I didn't reach for my lawyer yet. I reached for my medical records, the forensic toxicology reports, and every log I'd kept. The war of ink had begun, and this time the firebreak would have to be made of blood and bone. Patricia's office smelled of expensive parchment and cold determination, but today the air felt thick with the scent of a fresh digital kill. In my world, a smear isn't just an insult. It's a denial of service attack on a human life. Patricia's office was the only place where facts still had a fixed address, and I arrived at 9 a.m., ready to perform a clinical forensic autopsy on the lie Easton had bought. I sat in the high-backed leather chair, the dry, paper-scented air failing to calm the rhythmic thumping in my chest. Easton didn't just break the seal. He built a whole new delivery system for his poison. I said, staring at the blue flicker of a high-resolution spreadsheet on her wall-mounted monitor. Patricia nodded her face, a mask of cold professionalism. "He's not using chemicals this time, Lance. He's using ink and public opinion." We began tracing the digital poison, dissecting the article's metadata with the precision of a surgeon. I took a sip of bitter cold espresso and felt the entry tighten like a vice around my throat. Patricia had traced the funds for the hit back to a dormant shell company. It wasn't just any entity. It was an account Maria had set up decades ago for Easton's college fund, a legacy of motherly love reactivated in secret to fund his father's destruction. A shell company is like a virtual machine. You run a dirty process inside it, then delete the instance and hope nobody traces the logs back to the hardware. But Easton was never as good at covering his tracks as he was at spending my money. Patricia tapped a key, bringing up the smoking gun, a $15,000 payment categorized as consulting fees paid to a freelance investigative journalist 3 weeks prior. The timing correlates perfectly with the guardianship filing, she noted, her heavy silver pen clicking rhythmically against the mahogany desk like a countdown timer. $15,000 to buy my sanity. He's gotten cheaper over the months. It's enough to create a legal shadow, Lance, Patricia warned. And in that shadow, he can dismantle the Astor Foundation by triggering the sanity clause in the charter. I felt a visceral fury as I realized he was attempting to seize control of the $50 million legacy Maria and I had built. $15,000. The price of my reputation in the city I helped build. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was systematic. I received a notification on my tablet that felt like a physical blow. 2 of our major community partners in the West Side had just paused their grants from the Astor Foundation, citing the mental health concerns reported in the journal. They're pausing the planting in the West Side. I whispered the cold weight of the silver pen in my hand, feeling like a lead bar. Because of a lie Easton bought with a shell company Maria started for him. He isn't just trying to take the money anymore. He's salting the earth so that Maria's legacy becomes a footnote in a scandal. "We need to strike back, Lance." Patricia said, her eyes meeting mine with aggressive, protective instinct. Not in a boardroom, but on a stage. I stood up, my pulse steadying into a dangerous, analytical rhythm as the architect took full control of the man. The architect must now defend the structure in the court of public opinion, or watch it crumble under the weight of a paid-for fiction. Patricia checked a final log and found that the reporter wasn't just paid once. There was a secondary contract for a follow-up piece involving a forged medical affidavit from a doctor I haven't seen in a decade. I looked at the grant suspension email, once more realizing the clock was ticking. It felt like a line of code being deleted from a life-saving program. They're stopping the Oaks, Patricia. Because of him. I didn't wait for her to suggest a legal motion. Find me the reporter's home address. I'm not waiting for the next edition. Jonathan Wells's voice over the speakerphone sounded like it was coming from a bunker, muffled by the weight of a board of directors that was losing its nerve. The metallic hum of the device filled my study, a sterile vibration that underscored the professional isolation I was now enduring. Jonathan informed me that the board was moving to suspend my advisory role immediately. The smear campaign had worked with terrifying efficiency. The investors saw the word dementia and saw a liability, not a person who had spent 30 years building their value. Lance, they fear a crazy founder will tank the stock price before the next quarter. Jonathan said, his tone heavy with a reluctant corporate logic. I didn't lose my mind, Jonathan. I just lost my tolerance for predators, I countered, staring at the sharp white glare of the office whiteboard where I had mapped out the Astor Foundation's expansion. I realized I was being excommunicated from the temple I had built stone by stone. Jonathan was bound by fiduciary duty, not the 20 years of friendship we shared. Have you ever seen a board of directors turn into a pack of wolves at the first scent of a medical blood trail? Loyalty is just a variable that changes when the stock dips. I ended the call and met Patricia to finalize our counterstrike. We spent hours in her office compiling what I called the truth dossier. It was a cold blue light of a digital dossier that contained everything the lab reports from Dr. Stone, the recorded 3 a.m. hotel confession, the $15,000 payment receipt to the reporter, and a fresh, clean neurological exam from a neutral third party. I treated the preparation like a software patch, addressing every vulnerability Easton had exploited in the public's perception. We don't just defend Patricia, I told her, as I reviewed the data. We overwrite the entire narrative. They used ink to poison me. I'll use the truth to cauterize the wound. During our session, I revealed a critical component of the strike. I had secured a sworn affidavit from the freelance reporter's editor. The editor had been kept in the dark about the bribe and was now ready to turn the journal itself into my reluctant ally to save their own reputation. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. The stage is set. I decided on a public press conference at the Chicago Hotel Ballroom, the same place where I had once announced my first IPO. I wanted the cameras, the sharp lights, and the journalists to witness the bug in my son's character. I felt Maria's watch on my wrist, the heavy tick, reminding me that I was the steward of a legacy that could not be allowed to rot. Invite everyone, I instructed Patricia, the journal, the board, the foundation partners. By tomorrow night, the only one whose sanity will be questioned is Easton. We finalized the strategy, the smell of rain on the Chicago streets, drifting in through a cracked window as the afternoon faded into a bruised purple twilight. Calculations were complete, the logic was sound, and the architectural defense was ready for deployment. I returned to Riverside Towers, my mind already rehearsing the opening statement. But as I sat in the darkness of my living room, my security system pinged my tablet. I watched the monitor with a stillness that was almost clinical. A shadow moved in the loading dock, a shadow that bypassed the outer perimeter with a familiarity that chilled me. He knew my old security codes, or at least enough of the legacy architecture to find a gap. The threat wasn't just in the papers anymore. It was in the building moving toward the elevator. I didn't call the police. I didn't trigger the silent alarm. I wanted him to see the architect one last time before I burned his plan to the ground. I sat back in the shadows, waiting for the door to open, my heart beating with the steady, dangerous rhythm of a man who who has nothing left to lose but his name. The midnight alarm didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like an invitation. I sat in the darkened study, my face illuminated only by the blue-white flicker of security monitors. The shadow didn't just move through my home. It moved through my history, using a code I had given him on his 21st birthday to bypass the first layer of my life. I watched the grainy footage as Easton crept through the service door. He didn't know that I had spent the last 5 hours building a honeypot server, a digital mirror, that looked exactly like my production database. He believed he was accessing the core to delete the evidence of the $15,000 bribe, but every keystroke he made was being screen-capped and logged in real time. I felt a cold, final clarity. My son was no longer just a victim of greed. He was an active combatant in a war he could never hope to win. I waited until he reached the center of the living room, his specialized tablet glowing like a radioactive isotope in the gloom. "You're late, Easton," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "I expected you at the loading dock 10 minutes ago." He jumped the tablet, nearly slipping from his hands. "Dad." "What?" "Why are you sitting in the dark?" The smell of cold winter air from the open service door trailed behind him, a reminder of the breach he thought was secret. I stood up and illuminated the room with a single voice command. "I'm not the one who's lost Easton. I'm the one who built the labyrinth you're standing in." He tried to pivot his face, contorting into that practiced mask of concerned filial piety. "Dad, I came to check on you. The news report said you were having episodes and I found the door open." I pointed to the wall-mounted screen which was now live streaming the exact files he was trying to delete from the honeypot. In software, a hard crash is better than a slow memory leak. Tonight, the leak finally hit the ceiling. "You're sick, Dad." He screamed, his voice cracking with a desperate, hysterical edge. "This paranoia is exactly what the journal wrote about. You're a danger to yourself." I watched him realize that the digital door had slammed shut. His eyes went to the server rack in the corner of the room. Realizing his plan was dead, Easton lunged for the physical hardware, a primal attempt to destroy the truth with his bare hands. I sidestepped the attack with a grace fueled by pure adrenaline and the protective instinct I still held for Maria's legacy. Thud. The sound of my son hitting the floor was the sound of my last hope for him breaking. Before he could scramble back up the hallway, door burst open. 3 men in tactical black, their faces set in the same professional grimace I'd seen on my own developers during a late-night deployment, moved with a synchronized efficiency. The security team, pre-alerted, and waiting for my signal, pinned him to the hardwood with clinical force. The distant howling wind of the Chicago night was drowned out by the approaching wail of sirens. "It's over, Easton," I said, looking down at the wreckage. "The system is locked. Get off me." He was still shouting his words, muffled by the floor. "He's crazy. He's a danger." The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the room, a sharp, rhythmic punctuation to his defeat, as the security team pulled him upright to lead him toward the waiting police. His phone fell from his pocket, skittering across the floor. The screen was still active, revealing a frantic series of texts from Megan. The latest one read, "Finish it now or we lose everything." It was the confirmation I didn't need, but received anyway. She was the true engine behind this midnight breach. I looked at the blue lights of the squad cars reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling windows. My son was being led away in steel, and my daughter-in-law's voice was still screaming in the text bubbles on the floor. I didn't feel like a winner. I just felt like the only man left in the building. The morning sun was a cold, bright witness to the wreckage of my family. casting long, unyielding shadows across the hardwood floors where Easton had been pinned just hours before. I stood in the Chicago Hotel ballroom at 2:00 p.m., the same venue where I had once celebrated the high-stakes IPO that defined my career and my legacy. The bright lights of the ballroom didn't feel like a spotlight. They felt like a decontamination chamber burning away the lies that had tried to colonize my history. I stood before a packed room of journalists, board members, and foundation partners, feeling the weight of the air. I didn't just speak. I presented a masterclass in data integrity, projecting the forensic proof of the bribery, the midnight break-in footage, and a clean bill of health from the city's top neurologists. "My mind is not the problem, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing with a clarity that silenced the room. "The ethics of my heirs, however, have suffered a total system failure. I am not here to defend my sanity. I am here to secure the future of the Astor Foundation." I watched the reporter who wrote the smear piece shrink into her chair as the Business Journal issued a live public retraction. In a final move of architectural irony, I revealed that I had used the trusted party clause Easton himself had forged to donate 90% of his future dividends directly to the Astor Foundation. He would be forced to fund the very trees and hope he tried to destroy. A press conference is just a public debugging session. You find the error, you show the logs, and you let the system re-index itself around the truth. The blinding flash of camera bulbs was constant, a digital storm of accountability. Backstage, Jonathan Wells approached me, his face a mask of deep, sincere penance. "Lance, we were wrong. We let the noise distract us from the signal." He offered me a full apology and a permanent lifetime seat on the board with expanded powers. I accepted the seat, but I made it clear that my focus had shifted from silicon to soil. "Keep the office, Jonathan. I have trees to plant." I was resigning from active management, choosing instead to be the silent architect of the foundation's expansion. Silence. Not the empty kind, but the solid structural kind that comes after a war is won. I left the hotel and traveled to the West Side Community Park just as the sun began to set. The orange and purple hues of a Chicago sunset painted the sky, reflecting off the glass of the skyscrapers like a fading fire. I sat on a weathered bench, feeling the cold wind, but noticing the small, resilient buds on the oak saplings we had just put into the ground. I looked at Maria's watch. It was exactly 5:00 p.m. For the first time in a year, the architecture of my life was perfectly stable. The smell of damp earth and wood chips was better than any server room I had ever designed. "We made it, Maria. The fire breaks held. It's a clean build now." I felt my phone buzz in my pocket, a notification from the trust. Easton had requested to open Maria's letter early from his prison cell, but the system I built automatically denied it, enforcing the 6-month boundary even from afar. The rules I had written were immutable, a final gift of structure for a son who had none. I watched the sun dip below the Chicago skyline, casting long shadows across the fresh soil, and the rhythmic sound of a shovel hitting dirt nearby as a volunteer finished a row of planting. My phone buzzed again with another message from the trust. I didn't open it. I didn't need to look for a threat anymore. I just looked at the trees and smiled. The architecture was complete. The system was stable, and I was finally at peace with the world I had built. If you've stayed with me until this final moment, here is what I want to leave with you. This family story I've shared is not just mine. It reflects something uncomfortable and universal about inheritance, trust, and the mathematics of love. When I stood in that hospital room signing the sale papers for $50 million, I believed the hardest part was behind me. I was wrong. The real test came when my own son decided that waiting for me to die naturally took too long, that speeding up the timeline with a benzodiazepine warfarin cocktail was an acceptable business decision. That is the moment when a family story transforms into something darker, something you cannot unsee or unfeel. I want to be honest with you about my own failures. Don't be like me, don't confuse financial provision with genuine connection. I spent 30 years building systems, scaling servers, debugging code, but I never debugged the distance growing between Easton and me. I mistook his presence at quarterly dinners for intimacy, his polite texts for affection. I told myself that leaving him a fortune was love in its purest form. I was a fool. Love is not a wire transfer. It is presence, accountability, and the courage to say no when someone you raised chooses harm over healing. This family story taught me that legacy is not measured in zeros on a balance sheet, but in the principles you defend when everything is at stake. If there is any divine thread running through this nightmare, I believe God gives each of us just enough clarity in the darkest hour to choose survival over sentiment. That waiter Aaron whispering in my ear, that was my burning bush moment. Some might call it luck. I choose to see it as grace. The truth is, no amount of dad revenge can undo the wound of realizing your child sees you as an obstacle rather than a father. Dad revenge, if you can even call my legal maneuvers, that was never about punishment. It was about drawing a line in the sand and saying, "You will not erase me before I am ready to go." And when Easton broke into my condo months later when he screamed, "It should have been mine," I understood that the poison in the wine was only a symptom. The real toxin was entitlement left unchecked for decades. So here is my plea: if you are building something, whether it is a company, a portfolio, or just a stable household, build boundaries alongside it. Money does not fix character. It only amplifies what is already there. This dad revenge was never satisfying, only necessary. The foundation I built, the legal walls I erected, the press conference I held, all of it was survival, not victory. I wanted a son. I got a liability. That is the cost of mistaking wealth for wisdom. If this narrative resonates with you, or if you see shadows of your own relationships, in my experience, I invite you to leave a comment sharing your perspective. Subscribe to this channel for more nuanced reflections on money and morality, and share this account with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for walking this difficult road with me to the very end. Please note this account contains fictionalized elements crafted for educational purposes. If dramatized retellings are not your preference, I respect that. Feel free to explore other content that suits you better. But if the message here lingers, then perhaps it was meant for you.